Thank you very much for the detailed introduction. First of all, Professor Valinayaka, Professor Suranki, and Dr. Disanayaka, and ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an absolute honor to speak at this moment and wish you all the best. So, for my keynote, as I discussed with Dr. Disanayaka, I'll be speaking on the economic outlook and then also a bit on focus a bit more on the debt situation. Where is Sri Lanka at the moment? Just to introduce this thing, we went into a very deep crisis in 2022. So I require another lecture to explain why we went there, but let's focus on what happened afterwards. So we achieved stability. By stability meaning things were back to normal, inflation, exchange rate, all this. And then now Sri Lanka is at a phase where we need to grow as an economy. So we can't always be on the stability. Of course, stability is always needed. So now Sri Lanka is at a very critical stage where we need to accelerate into another mode, change gears. So that's where we are. And also, whether it's the previous government, this government, the path taken is the right path, but these floods have also been a bit of a hit. As you know, the damage is huge. According to government estimates, around $7 billion worth of damages. 7 billion is a very, very high amount. That's almost 2.5 times the IMF program, and $7 billion is 1.5 times the total debt we have borrowed from China. So we have to be fair for this government or any future that these things have to be taken into consideration. So these will set things back a bit. With that, I'll just, as I mentioned, so things have got back into normal. You know, interest rates at the peak of the crisis at around 30%. Now back into single digits. Inflation 70%, back into normal. So a lot of credit also goes to the central bank. At that time, people were saying, you know, interest rates are high, how can we function? But the main thing is inflation. If inflation goes up, everything goes up. You know, from the raw materials to the people who are working, everything goes up. So keeping that into control is the key thing. And domestic demand normalizing and all this. But what is missing? There are still a lot of missing pieces here, which I will go into a bit of detail. One thing is confidence still remains conditional. So there are a number of factors where the confidence on the economy is based on conditions that have to be met. For example, the IMF program talks about political stability, whether the reforms will be done. External shocks. So all these would be coming in. Investments coming in, so that also is understandable. If you look at it, debt overhang. When there's a country where debt is 100% of GDP, that also puts a bit of brakes on investment. So that has to be worked into. For that, reforms are needed. Households, SMEs still struggling. So non-performing loans in the double digits. Households after the hit, they are at an edge, so they cannot stomach much more. So we are sort of like slowly coming back into the more growth. You know, came from consumption, but actual growth has to come from productivity increase, which is how growth actually comes. So just to give a update, many people, now we always see the government talking about growth 5%, 4%. Just to give a thing about history, you know, there was this thing called economic growth did not exist before 200 years ago, like before the Industrial Revolution. So growth came into existence when the Industrial Revolution because of innovation. People's productivity increased. So that was how. Otherwise, countries used to grow when they invaded another country or when their populations increased. So right now, Sri Lanka needs to switch into increased productivity, that's innovation, and technology has to be infused. and at the same time infrastructure. So that also has a very big multiplier effect. So those are the key areas from which we need to get growth if it is to be sustainable in the long term. Structural reforms, which I will speak on, which is needed. One is, of course, state-owned enterprises reforms, some of them loss-making. Just to give an example, I'm not advocating for privatization, but as the government, the current government has said, we have to change them into not necessarily profit-making, but not loss-making. So just to give an example, in 2024, Sri Lankan Airlines debt was taken over by the Treasury. That was amounting to 500 million US dollars. So 500 million US dollars is almost equal to the entire personal income tax collection for 1 year. So if you all are paying 36%, last year basically you all paid all that just to cover the debt of one loss-making institute. So when you are paying income tax at 36%, that means if you are working 5 days, 2 days you are working for the government. So that 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, last year you worked just to cover the debt of Sri Lankan Airlines, to make it very simple. So I'm not disting it. I'm sure we will get it into a profit mode. I have confidence. But just to say why I want to, the reason I say this is because we have to understand why it's important. Because there are people who come and say SOE reforms, trade reforms, but we don't know why. So this is the reason. These money can be used for many other things. The second thing is trade reforms. So why are we in discussion? I'll give you 3 examples. Now, one example is China. China from 1978 it opened its economy. The next 40 years, China for such a large country, it's unprecedented in history. It grew at almost double digits. At some points, even 14%. So another example is India, 91. Before 91, we know India was not doing well. After 91, today it's the largest, the fastest growing major economy in the world. And Vietnam. We all now see Vietnam is just growing like very extremely fast. So what changed them? If you ask me, if you study the factors, just one thing, their trade policies changed. So they opened their economies. When you open your economy, you become more competitive. So if you're closed, this is the fundamental thing. Even if you look at one of Sri Lanka's most famous economists, Professor Premachandra Athukaranga, he's now based in Australia. So even he says in 1977 we opened, but according to him, we didn't open enough. So that was the problem. Another thing is to do with trade. Between 1948 and 1956, few people know this. Sri Lanka was basically the second best economy in Asia. We were the best. A lot of people said the Switzerland of Asia. We were actually giving money to the Bank of England. And our first Prime Minister, D.S. Senanayake, it is recorded that while he was talking to people, IMF and World Bank people had come. And somebody has said they want to meet you. And he has told them, I don't have time to meet them. So that is where we were. But things took a turn because of I'm not talking about the intentions. Of course, all governments want to do it. But in 56, we changed. We put import restrictions, many of the other things, which we went into another direction, especially like India, Argentina, all of them. So that's the importance of trade reforms. Regulatory reforms, what we find, these are blocks that are preventing growth. For example, there's a study that about 30% of SME costs comes from regulations, meeting regulations. And even currently I'm consulting, so when I meet people, especially on the policy front, I understand the issues being faced. Land, labor, so these are very difficult things which put away investments. So these are a number of things that are still missing. So we shouldn't be, it's always good to be very confident of the future because we already know that some of the steps have not yet been taken. If they're taken, there's still room for us to grow and become a developed country in the coming decades. So at the same time, we also have to be very realistic. As people say, some of us think that Sri Lanka can become Singapore. Of course, we can. I mean, there was a point when Singapore wanted to be like us, but you have to be. But right now, they are quite tough. So this involves going through tough paths for at least a couple of decades in order to get there. There is no easy way. So recently, someone was asking me in a panel, a CEO of an institute. So they asked me whether the electricity price increase, it was subsidizing with the government, was that right? Because the government increased prices by 15% to remove the subsidies. So I told him, what is the other option? Of course, the government cannot, they can keep the electricity prices low, but how will the government find it? Of course, to cover that, the government will increase taxes. The government will borrow for 2 to 3 years through bills, bonds, others, and then what the whole country could have paid that 15% now, we will be paying in 3 to 4 years with interest. So the thing is, there is no such thing as free money. So whatever we take for now, it actually comes back to bite us later. So if you look at this Sri Lanka, most of the debt came from subsidies, many others. So just to clarify, I'm not against subsidies. So even according to the World Bank and others, we find different modes of sending money. For example, direct cash transfers. Those are much more helpful than subsidizing petrol, diesel and others. So an example would be, we've had subsidized prices for fuel, petrol and others. But who benefits from this? You find somebody coming in a BMW and pumping petrol at subsidized prices. And does the poor person get this? No. And if you look, this is one part of the injustice where the rich get this thing. The second part of the injustice is when it comes to tax policies. In Sri Lanka, about 70% of taxes is indirect taxes. So direct means personal income tax, corporate tax, that is few. So the rich pay their share, but if you look at per income in Sri Lanka, actually the poor pay more because of the indirect taxation. Let's take some basic products, because most of the government revenue comes from things like VAT, excise taxes, all these things. So if you take a normal product which everybody uses and there is VAT, the richest man in Sri Lanka and the poorest person in Sri Lanka basically use the same thing. Just because you are the richest man in Sri Lanka doesn't mean you can eat 100 plates of food. So the mode of income for the government is also unfair. We call this regressive taxation. So what you find is when you give subsidies, and when there is somebody who is driving a BMW who is getting subsidized fuel, and the person paying for the subsidies is the poor person, so here you find the sort of imbalance. So these are just one point to clarify. So getting back onto Sri Lanka's economic outlook, the potential growth drivers, of course, exports. We have to work on that. And as I mentioned, for exports, recently Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, former Central Bank Governor, was saying, one of the reasons why people need to understand that in order to export, we also need to import. If you look at the apparel industry, we always claim that apparel industry brings $5 billion every year. But in order to bring $5 billion worth of exports, do you know the apparel industry needs to import $3 billion worth of goods, capital goods and intermediate goods. So the net export is only $2 billion. So when you put tariffs against these inputs, our exports become higher in prices. So this is what keeps our exports less competitive. So what Dr. Kumaraswamy was saying is that when you increase duties or para-tariffs and others, what happens? Ultimately, your exports become more expensive and you're losing out on the market. And this also results in the consumers not benefiting. For example, let me give an example why institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, of course, I'm not defending these institutions, they have their flaws, but some of the things. Recently, I heard potato and onion, the government was subsidizing it. So, increasing the prices so that the farmers can sell at a proper rate to survive. But what does this mean? So, in order to give a good price for a few thousand farmers, 22 million people have to buy potatoes and onions at a higher price. So, this is what is happening throughout when I talk about trade restrictions. So, when you allow importation, of course, people will say foreign exchange would go out, but this has been seen in countries like Chile. Of course, it's going to be a short-term thing, but what it allows is when you do this, the entire economy becomes more competitive. So what imports and others do is they cleanse. Whichever is unproductive goes out of business, and whatever industries that remain in Sri Lanka are export competitive. Because if they can survive with imports coming in, of course they can also able to export very well. So this, as business students will understand that the efficiency, competitiveness increases the output very easily. So just whatever happens to the business happens at a country level. So exports have to grow. Another thing is also what Sri Lanka focuses is we have a few issues with exports. One is basket is very small. We are entirely dependent on apparel, tea, rubber, coconut, some electrical goods. If you look at countries like Vietnam, it's much more diverse. So if you look at, for example, the ratings of why developing countries have higher borrowing costs, one of the reasons is that the products are less diverse here. So we are totally dependent on a few products like apparel, tea. So these are mostly like consumer products which, if there is a recession in the West, and also another fact is about half of our exports go to the West, the US and Europe. So when there is a recession there, these are people cut down on wearing clothes, people cut down on consuming tea. So these are things that they reduce consuming, and automatically our exports come down. And what do we import a lot? This is another factor. Is energy. So oil, $3 billion worth of oil. So here we are constantly at the mercy of other countries, where something goes on. Like right now, Venezuela, the US is going to attack Venezuela. Prices go up, we are in trouble. So, and if you look at the total exports from apparel, the net exports from apparel, tea, all these things, everything comes just to pay for energy imports. So we are earning from all these, from our top 5 sectors, the income coming is just going for importing energy. So the money is just coming from here and going to probably Iran, Saudi Arabia and others. So what we need to do, which I have always said, is renewable energy. So that is, Sri Lanka has, according to the World Bank, our offshore wind energy potential itself is more than our needs. So we can export energy itself, wind alone. Then we have solar. Mana and others have the highest solar density. Hydro, of course, with the floods we saw, but very few people know that we have a very high, one of the highest river densities in the world. For a small island, we have like around 22 rivers. So much potential for hydro. And this is something that's coming up. So, green, convert it into green hydrogen, export it or connect a grid to India, export energy to India. So these are things which can be solved, especially in these areas if we focus on the right thing. Then FDI, foreign direct investment. So this is definitely a must, because currently, right now, the government does not have the capacity to spend on infrastructure. We are very, very limited, which I will come on the debt side later. So even right now, we have allocated 4% of GDP, which is one of the highest, but still it's not that high. And you can't blame it. The government has the only options are increased taxes and others, which is not possible at this moment. So we need foreign direct investment. And I can give a list, but I'll just give you another example of why Sri Lanka may not be competitive and where we need to this thing. So trade reforms come in that also. One thing is we have the highest food prices in South Asia. Vehicle prices, third highest in the world. When it comes to electricity, highest. Construction, highest. So most of these are things that could be important, but we have barriers and other things. Food, we have taxes on certain things. I think Advocata did a study on that. So if you look at Sri Lanka and Malaysia per capita is 3 times richer than us. But chicken there is much cheaper than here. So when you have high food prices to protect certain groups, high electricity prices because we did not invest in renewable energy, high construction prices, what does this result in? This results in workers demanding a higher wage to survive. So if these prices were brought down by importing, liberalizing the economy, all these things, however much, let's say we are earning 300,000 a month and spending that, our cost would come down drastically to 150,000. That surplus we can spend, the economy grows better. So this is one of the reasons why labor costs are one of the highest in South Asia. So that is investment. Infrastructure development, of course, it has a high multiplier effect. But there are key constraints as far as the economy goes. One thing is policy uncertainty. So in Sri Lanka, one of the reasons for investments not coming or the economy not picking up is policy uncertainty. As you see, for decades, if you look at the past 30 years, our VAT itself has been changed a dozen times. So businesses cannot plan. As business students, you all know that businesses usually plan for 5 to 6 years minimum. You can't plan like every 6 months ahead. So when prices increase, policies, uncertain, taxes change every year through the budget, there is no consistency. I have spoken to many investors who want to invest, and they have told tax is not an issue. The bigger issue is uncertainty. Just make the tax even high, but keep it consistent. Then we can plan. So policy uncertainty is one thing. The second thing, as I mentioned, debt overhang. So when there is high debt, investors usually don't come because they know that the government, one thing is the government could very well default again. The other thing is the government cannot provide incentives. Their expenditures are restrained. Revenues, they will go after, try to get more taxes. So these things. So that is one issue. High cost of doing business, I mentioned. High taxation, this is another problem we have. But one thing that has to be clarified about Sri Lanka is, in 2022, our government revenue to GDP was below 8%, which is probably one of the lowest, or you can say even the lowest in the world. Even right now, we are trying to get to 15%, which is, even if we get to 15%, it will still be one of the lowest in the world. So I'm definitely not saying we should increase it, but the tax base is very, very distinct. At the height of the crisis, there were only 60,000 active income tax files for the entire country of 22 million people. So the cars on the road itself are a million. So what we think is like the base is so narrow, a lot of people who should be paying are not paying. Therefore, the very few who come under the formal sector have to pay a very high amount. So that is not just about tax rates, but about administration, digitalization, transparency. So these are things that has to definitely be working on. And need for deeper reforms. So with that, I'll shift to Sri Lanka's debt outlook, some of the challenges. So overall, public debt comes to around 100% of GDP. At the peak, it was 128% of GDP. So right now, we have a very, very high debt problem. So the gross financing needs are also high. So gross financing needs means the interest payments the government has to make the capital or the maturity that the government has to pay plus the additional the deficit on that. So if you look at the government's, the treasury, for next year, we are set to borrow 6.8 trillion rupees. So 6.3, just to explain, that means in 2026, every minute we would be borrowing 13 million rupees, every minute. So that is to sustain. Of course, this is not the fault of the current government, but this is the way we have come to this point. Of course, the debt is going to drastically come down because some of the things, projected payments will come down, but this is the current situation. So this is a lot of money. So in order to, but just to explain why we borrow, so there are many people I have spoken to, some say, why should we borrow? We don't need to borrow. 6.8 trillion you can't pay in any other way. That's a lot of money. So even if you look at current government revenue, it only comes to total 4.5 trillion. So this has a long way to go. So even if you double income tax, double corporate tax, all this, you will still not get the target. So there has to be borrowing for some more time. Of course, if we do the things correctly, we will be back on track. But this is the current situation of the country. So we've got into a thing where once you borrow, and if you borrow and you spend it on consumption rather than spending it on investment, like Singapore, for example, there, if the government borrows, they have to come to parliament and they have to explain it. So here sometimes we borrow for consumption, so debt obviously piles up. If we don't grow at the rate of the interest rates, obviously we are in trouble. So that also has got us into trouble. So domestic debt levels still remain high because out of the 6.8 trillion, about 6 trillion has to be borrowed from the domestic market. So this also means that local banks and others, this leaves out money for the private sector and increases interest rates. So these are disadvantages why it's always good to work on reducing debt. So what are some of the policy options? So with such high debt levels, of course I just want to make a point that there are sometimes I write for the papers or give talks, and you also find people of opposing views. They just come and write, the government should reduce taxes, we should spend more, that's the way to go through, the IMF does not know what it's doing, all these things. So I'm always like saying, of course, we should decreasing taxes and increasing expenditure is always good, but they never explain how you do it. How do you do it? So if this was that simple, any government would do it. So I'll give you a few options of how to do this. And all of them are, almost impossible. One is, of course, we can increase revenue, increase taxes, which will not be popular among the people. The other thing is reducing expenditure. How can you reduce expenditure? About 80% of expenditure in this country is recurrent expenditure. That is salaries, pensions, state sector employees. And the other one is interest payments. So we can't touch on that. It's very difficult to reduce salaries or lay people off. That's unpopular. The other thing is capital expenditure. If you don't spend it, the economy won't grow. So currently, even the 4% allocated was underutilized. That's why we have the massive primary surplus. But that is good because that's helping us during the flood. But in the long term, underutilization of capital will have an effect on growth. So that is the second option. Of course, you will agree that is not popular. Third option, how to do all this, is privatization. So of course, that is also would be unpopular. There would be groups protesting, but at the same time, privatization will not cover everything. We don't have that much institutions which we can sell to cover the level of debt we have. The other is restructuring domestic debt. So domestic debt, most of the domestic debt is bought by banks and others. So you restructure that, these banks will go down. And with that, most of our deposits and others. So fourth option is out. So last thing is, of course, as we saw the example, we can change the central bank. Right now we can't do it. and start printing money. But we saw in 2022 what happened when we started printing money. The prices went up. Though we say supply chain issues, COVID, COVID also hit India, Bangladesh, Singapore, everyone. Their prices didn't go up like prices of food didn't double or triple. Only in Sri Lanka, because we just went on printing money, not an option. So people who criticize the IMF or say we shouldn't be doing this, other than the 5 options, if they can come up, that will be wonderful. That will be something that we can all think of. But it's not possible. That is why governments function the way they function, because it's very difficult to move. So these are some of the options. Everything will have a bad effect. So I'll come on to external debt. So external debt is what got us into the crisis. If you saw in 2022, we didn't default on domestic debt, we defaulted on external debt. External debt is borrowed in foreign currency and most of the time in foreign law. So here again we have restructured the debt. So now it's manageable, but still it's a very, very thin line that we have to walk in. So external debt is not like domestic. Domestic debt, even at the absolute worst thing, you can sort of monetize it by printing or increase taxes, change laws, force banks to buy all these things. External, you can't because it's in dollars. You have to borrow or default. So here we have the issue. So reserve targets for next year, I think just today we got it. The IMF projected 7.2 billion by end of this year, but now they have downgraded it to 6.5 billion because of the floods and others. But even before that, we were struggling. So and next year we should be over around 9 billion, but again that has been revised. So the reason why we need higher reserves is always to keep as a buffer for external shocks. See, why we went bankrupt in 2022 was the debt became unsustainable as early as 2020. So if we had gone to the IMF in 2020, we would have gone to the IMF with 7.9 or over $7 billion in reserves. And we wouldn't have had all these crises. It would have been a much linear program. So here I have to credit to the government. So they have been very proactive on this front. They have quickly applied to the IMF to get this $200 million. So it's good that they are alert. But sometimes this is usually as a buffer, the reserve targets. So this can prevent us from external shocks. For example, external shocks can come in the form of oil price increases, Trump's tariffs, which are very unpredictable, could come anytime, global economic slowdown, interest rates going up. I'll just give a few examples. Of course, these countries had numerous problems, and these are not the reasons they defaulted, but what triggered them in history. If you look at Mexico in 1994, what triggered the Mexican crisis? It was because the US increased interest rates. Argentina in 2001, what triggered Argentina to default? Brazil devalued its currency, therefore Argentina is there. The Russian crisis happened in 1998 because of the Asian financial crisis. Asian financial crisis happened because the Thailand devalued their currency. And most importantly, in 1991, we heard this, India went to the brink of becoming bankrupt. And if anybody can guess that, anyone guess what triggered India to go to the brink of bankruptcy? You'll be surprised. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So that caused oil prices to go up and India went to the brink. So same way, I've said, domestically we can do everything right, but externally shocks are there. So we need the buffers. So that is why it's very important to get the reserves. Okay. So I'll just try to finish this. I think I'm out of time. So I'll just answer 3 main questions, and with that I'll conclude my talk. So a key question is, currently we are seeing on the government side or everywhere that we have stability, macroeconomic stability is important, all these. So that is absolutely essential. But does that guarantee economic growth? So that is a question we have to answer. Something I'd like to state about macroeconomic stability is that we had macroeconomic stability for almost 10 out of 11 years during the presidency of Chandrika Bandaranaike, except 2001 when we went into a crisis. So we had stability. During President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, 10 years, we had stability. Yahapal's time, we had stability. So stability itself is not, it's a great achievement when you compare it to 2022. But having stability does not ensure growth. So I always give this example, of the IMF, just to put it in a much simpler thing. People expect growth, but you see, the IMF's role is not ensuring growth or to make us into the next Singapore. IMF is a stabilization program. Like, for example, who goes to the IMF when you have critical debt problem where you're almost going to default, or when you have a balance of payment crisis. So if you take, just to give it in a medical term, it's like a patient who's probably hit by a car, he's taken to the ICU, intensive care unit. So the ICU doctor is the IMF. So what is the doctor's role there? So economic growth is more like winning a race, maybe a 100-meter race. So the ICU doctor's role is making sure your blood pressure is normal, your sugar level is normal, your cholesterol is normal, you're able to walk, you're able to breathe and come out. So when this person comes out and somebody asks, how are you going to be at the 100-meter race? He can't say that, I'll be in the 100-meter race because the ICU doctor said my cholesterol is normal, my pressure is normal, this thing is normal. Your pressure and all this should be normal anyway. So of course you need your pressure and your cholesterol to be normal to win the 100-meter race. But just because they are normal doesn't mean you're going to win the race. So this is a critical point that Sri Lanka, I feel, does not understand. So stability is absolutely essential for growth, but stability does not guarantee it. You need to change gear from the first to the second to move on. And the second thing is, we are seeing this government, I would say, doing a remarkable job on the fiscal side. So the budget, the treasury has 1.2 trillion rupees, which has come in very handy for the current situation. But another point that I always state is Sri Lanka has a twin deficit problem. One is fiscal. By fiscal, I mean the treasury, the rupees coming into the treasury and going out. So that is balanced. But the second problem is the dollars coming into the country and going out. That's the current account. 2022 we defaulted, we had problems on both sides, but we defaulted on the external side because we didn't have enough dollars. So there is the problem. So if you look at most of the countries like Asian financial crisis, Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea, and all these countries got into trouble, their fiscal side was good. Another example is Mexico. Currently, we Sri Lankans, we are claiming that we have achieved a primary surplus for 3 years now. But in Mexico, from Mexico defaulted in 1994, from 1983 to 1994, for 11 years, they had a primary surplus. They were managing their treasury and everything even better than Sri Lanka is doing. But within 6 months, Mexico went to the brink of default. That is because interest rates in the US went out and money started flowing out. So that is always a danger we have to keep in. So what I feel is like we are too focused on one thing while the other one can slip out of control. Like a shock, like the flood here, Trump invading Venezuela, oil prices going up, or suddenly a tariff coming in our way. Anything could happen. Even the 2022 crisis, of course, there's a lot of policy errors from the Sri Lankan side, but certain things also accelerated it. COVID came in, Russia-Ukraine war, fertilizer, food prices went up. So those things sort of accelerated the country that was going down further down faster. So these are shocks that can be done. And last thing I want to state before I summarize is that the role, so these are just common problems that I answer, the role of the IMF and the central bank. So first thing is, IMF's role, as I mentioned before, is a stabilizer. So its job is to get countries stable. So it is not IMF is not a development bank like the World Bank or ADB. So you cannot depend on them to get growth. Their job is to bring you back to normal, to a position where most of the time you can start borrowing once again. But whether you borrow and keep going back to the IMF like Argentina, or you do the correct reforms like India and never go back to the IMF, is up to you. And there is also a criticism, but also if you look at countries like India and all, we say India, it's been 34 years, India never went back to the IMF, and it's the fastest growing large economy in the world. And you know what? People credit Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao for doing all the reforms, but very few people know this. What got India to change was they implemented World Bank and IMF reforms. So those were the reforms. Like, thing is, like, we say 17 programs, but half of the programs we go out midway. Even during 2016, we were in an IMF program, government changed, we move out. We never implemented. So we can't always blame them. So, and the other thing is, of course, the central bank. So there is also another notion that, people say interest rates should be brought down. They are not helping towards growth. You see, the mandate of the central bank is to keep inflation under control, 5%. So that is to make sure the money in your pocket does not lose value above 5%. That is their core. This thing. Second thing is to ensure financial system stability. That means, so when you go to the bank actually has your money and does not close down. Insurance companies. So it is not the role of the central bank to do economic growth. So that is the job of the treasury and the government. So with that, I'll just conclude. So as far as I see stability achieved, and if we do the correct reforms, I think Sri Lanka has a great future. I mean, we have a lot of things that go our way. One is our position in the country, in the strategic location, one of the best tourist destinations, and most of all, the talent we have. So even here, we have so much of talent. So even for such a small country, we've had great achievers. There is a Sri Lankan who was I think a co-founder at Facebook. A Sri Lankan was a former chief economist of the World Bank. So we have tremendous talent. And if you see, most of the Sri Lankans, when they go out, they perform very well. So that also shows that a lot of hurdles, these things. If we free them up, this can be a really great nation. So it is not something that we are not going towards. In 1940, as I mentioned, we were one of the best economies in Asia. So it is just about finding our way back to where we were. So most of these reforms, you get these things done, we are back. As I began my talk, the key difference, China did in 78, India did in 91, and Vietnam in 86 was trade reforms. And if you look at it the other way, Argentina was the 5th largest economy in the world at the beginning of the last century. So they were at one point going to overtake the US. And what reversed them? Trade policies. They changed into the same policies that we did in 1956. So with that, I'll conclude. I think there's a lot of hope for this country. And I'm very optimistic. And thank you very much for having me. Thank you.